Alright, Game Bears, it is time for another episode of Unused Content and Games, and today, going in order with the Mega Man X games, we have Mega Man X2. So, let us begin with this, starting with the prototype information, but before we truly begin, I do gaming content like this all the time, looking at unused content and games. If you enjoy that and that's the type of thing, at any point in time in this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's for free, and you can always change your mind later on, so you don't miss another one of these videos. Anyways, let us begin with Mega Man X2 prototype. Two Japanese prototypes of Mega Man X2 were found and dumped by C. Davis in 2018. Just looks that out up there. The first prototype hereafter refers to as the later or newer build. It was released by Rockman Corner on July 21st, presumably back in 2018. The second prototype, the earlier older build, was purchased through the funding efforts of Evidence, Gold S, and C. Davis, then released by the Cutting Room Floor on October 6th. Alright, and these are those downloaded versions if you're curious about those early beta versions. Note that the raw version is a pure unmodified ROM dumped from the sample cartridge. It will not work on emulators since the header info hasn't been finalized yet. Please use the hacked version, which fixes the header to run this prototype on an emulator. Certain emulators that don't properly emulate the CX4 chip will exhibit incorrect behaviors while trying to run these prototypes. As of this writing, SNES and SNES 9X will exhibit the following errors: incorrect positioning of sprites. This includes select stage previews, C. Cantler, probably Bubble Crab, Magna Centipede's rotating tail attack, and Morphmoth's cocoon. Alright, wireframe models either crashing the emulator in the case of the ZSNES, or not displaying properly, but having their hitboxes intact in the SNES 9X build. Other CX4 fixed breaking, e.g. Morphmoth's lasers, while B SNES will accurately display graphics and position sprites. It seems to freeze at certain points. The most stable emulators available at the moment is B SNES Plus. Starting with the intro title and the intro menus, both prototypes are missing the prologue cutscene. You know, the one where Green Biker Guy dies. The earlier prototype plays no music during the title sequence. Here's what that would look like. Here's the Japanese version of Rockman X2. Says sample just like in the first game. And here's another later version. Alright, here is some prototype demo trailers. The older prototype has a game start as the option, plus both prototypes say sample. That's another difference right there. It mostly looks similar to how it looks in the final game. I don't think these enemies are seen in the final version. Been a bit since I played X2, but I'm pretty sure those guys don't appear in the final game. And this wall looks a little different as well. Here's an early version of the mechanoid you fight at the beginning of the game. That are just some prototype versions. Yeah, he definitely looks a little different compared to the final version. Still looks fat as all hell, but anyways, I guess that's just how they created him. Try to give him an imposing size. Alright, nothing much here seems to be all that different. Man, what a skill issue. You gotta get good at this game. But anyways, and here's the final version of the demo. And right off the bat, the platforms look different. And they spawn you right over here. It's likely there just as a way to test out the boss fight a little sooner. Alright, now he has his current design. With those white-looking nipples? What are those? He didn't have those in the prototype build. Maybe it's because I've never gone down here during that boss fight, but I honestly didn't know you could take damage from his boots. Because, like, why would you go all the way down there? There's no way to hit the boss from there. And once again, skill issue. Anyways. Alright, the early intro stage demo plays from the start of the stage to the gigantic mechanoid fight. The final game's demo starts at the gigantic mechanoid fight. Alright, the sample version has 2 extra demos for Moth and Wire Sponge's stage. These demos were likely recorded for the summer CES 1994 build, which only features the intro in these 2 stages. And as a result, the demos no longer sync up with the layouts of either prototypes. For Moth, the desync occurs at the old robot's fight entrance, while in Wire Sponge's stage, the desync occurs on the first solar area. And one thing I just noticed actually in this demo, if we go back a bit, the area where you're supposed to... Let me X this out, it's annoying. The area where you're supposed to get one of the armor pieces, I forgot which one, been a bit since I played this. Right over here. If you look very closely, there's a little gap over here that's not visible in the final version, kind of hinting that there's something down there. In the final version, you're supposed to use the helmet parts to find that instead. Wonder why he's just standing there. Or an early version of this boss fight. If I were him, I'd be damage boosting past him, but whatever, he isn't doing that. This is just the rest of this boss fight. And here's an early version of Wire Sponge's stage. Hey, let's see if he gets the heart piece. No, he doesn't. Oh well. Perhaps it just wasn't placed there yet. These laser enemies are a little different than I remember. Once again, skill issues. Just X that out, don't need that to be there. Alright, password. The password screen is normally accessible in the early prototype, using Pro Action Replay, PAR with that code, on the top screen and select Game Start to access it. Here's what it looked like in the first game, and now the early prototype of it. That's very much widely unfinished, with these weird graphics over here. I always like this little photo of Zero over here. And this early password screen has its sprites set up like the screen in the first game, complete with glitched metals. But the graphics are new, and they were already planning to expand the grid from 4x3 to 4x4. The game uses the sprite palette of X1 here, which does fit with the new password digits. The correct palettes are stored in the ROM of 0x02C9A0 to 0x02CA1F, and are identical to the 4 palettes in the later prototype. Passwords from both X1 and X2 are incompatible with this prototype, and it's currently unknown what passwords do work, if any. Alright, here's an early portrait of Zero giving a thumbs up, which actually looks pretty cool. He's here to tell you you're doing a good job, and here's the final version, which I think looks really neat. I think one of the few times he's used Zero's smile as well, throughout this X series specifically. The other graphics are glitched on the screen. The image of Zero and Surges that indicate a correct or incorrect password, respectively, are already in the ROM and loaded to RAM. Surge's graphic is identical, while Zero's graphic was redrawn to look less cute, I guess. Alright, by the later prototype, the 4x4 grid was implemented and the sprites were set up like in the final game. Though the border, background, and password digit graphics are all different, the password system itself is close to that of the final version, but isn't quite finished yet. Notably, the password that would normally start the player at the last Sigma stage in the final game with this code over here is rejected in the prototype. Makes sense. The game doesn't want you to cheese your way through the game. All right, here's the early prototype that we saw earlier. Here's the later prototype, looking a little more bland. And here's the final game. Alright, and options. Early prototype options is very clearly unfinished. Here's the later prototype version, looks a little bland. Kind of looks like one of those options menus you see on, like, arcade games. And the final version. Pretty much looks the same as this one, just the lighting on some things is a little different. This is normally accessible in the early prototype using Pro Action Replay, this code right over here, on the title screen, and press start to access it. This is inaccessible. It's inaccessible for a good reason. It's completely unchanged from the first game. The options mode most likely just carries straight over to save a little time. The option mode graphic is no longer in the ROM, so the game displays a collection of garbage tiles instead. The button assignments and sound test still works, though the action test, sound options, and text and exit test use a darker palette in the later prototype. The golden bar were rounded out a bit in the final version. You can see that here. Our intro stage graphics. A few of the tiles in the mountainous background were touched up for the final game. Note the shading on the border of the large dome-like mountain and the tiles that connect the mountains to the lower part of the sky. Alright, here's the prototype version. And here's the final version, which I don't really notice much differences, to be fair with you, but perhaps you notice a difference. Alright, the shading on top of the rocky tiles at the start of the stage is darker in the final version, and the sand dunes is slightly smoother. Alright, here's what the beta one looks like. And here's the final game. Alright, there's a problem with one of the 256 by 256 blocks in the early prototype. This block, the one on the middle, is designed to connect with the one on the left. The problem comes when it's repeated twice in a row. The railings on the bottom look okay, but the one in the middle is connected to nothing, and the one on top doesn't properly hook up with the bridge to the left. Later versions shift all of the graphics to that 256 by 256 blocks to the left. Then extended the railing further right to make up for the lost space. And here's what the early prototype version of this looks like. And here's a final version, which I guess looks a little longer. That's about it. Yeah, some of the background elements are a little different, like whatever these light switch looking things are. Alright, layouts. This Shriver, the first one in the game, was removed in the final game. Alright, here's what the prototype looks like. This little screw enemy, I guess, wasn't supposed to be there. And it's not there in the final game. Alright, the final game redraws the floor tiles and the pipes and accoutrements, I guess that's the word, as such on the walls and ceilings. Here's what that looks like in the prototype version. Here's what it looks like in the final version. Alright, the final game redraws the floor tiles and the pipes that accoutrements and such on the... Well, I already read that. Sorry. There are fewer platforms and ladders in the prototype version. You can see that here, like there's more on this side over here, and some of the platforms are noticeably larger too. The platforms go up higher in the prototypes, putting the player in direct line of contact with the gigantic mechanoid's head. Easier to hit, but easier to take damage to. The final version lowers the platforms, forcing the player to jump and fire unless they go to the platform at the top right. See, that does force them to jump up, actually, so they don't take damage so easily. It is the first boss of the game, after all, it makes sense. But here's a closer look. Miscellaneous. Oh no, it's Green Biker Dude again. He probably has the same fate no matter which version we look at. The background starts at a different offset in the early prototype, with this little light in the background. Beating this stage in the prototype shows a password screen. In the final game, the password screen only shows up after the Eccentrics cutscene plays. The Eccentrics cutscene was likely not made yet at the time. In both prototypes, the player can pause during the opening ride chaser section, or sequence. Something not possible in the final version. Here's a closer look. And here's the final version. Alright, X-Hunter's intro cutscene. This cutscene does not exist in the older prototypes. The X-Hunter silhouettes are missing, likely because they weren't made yet. No music plays during the cutscene, because the music hadn't been made yet. The darker palette that the final version uses for the cutscene doesn't exist yet, so the standard central computer stage palette is used instead, for a Magna Centipede stage most likely. So they had to change it up a little. Holding the Y button during the cutscene will cause X to charge his X-Buster. This was corrected in the final version. Makes sense because you're not supposed to be playing as him at that point in the game. I'm glad they added the silhouettes later, or else you won't know who's talking here. And here's what it looks like in the final version. Alright, weapons menu. Alright, the early weapons menu uses a different design than the later prototypes and final game. It's a set of borders inside a border, inside another border. A lot of borders. In the later prototype and final game, the weapons menu uses the same tile set as the password screen, so the same differences apply. The unselected items are brighter than they are in the final game, and the exit option is lower on the screen. The exit graphics reuses the graphics from the first game in the early prototype. Since having a graphic that says exit above text that also says exit is redundant, the graphic was changed. The end of the meters are 1 pixel wider in the earlier prototype. The Giga Crush in the item tracer uses the standard energy meter in the older prototype, while in the newer prototype and final game they use unique blue meters. The item tracer is called Search R, Search Radar, on this screen. In the early prototype, the graphic uses a placeholder 10 icon on the screen only. The space where Zero's parts would be is taken up by an X2 graphic in the older prototype, most likely because that plot point of getting Zero's body parts back wasn't thought of yet. Though the graphic of Zero's parts are in earlier prototype ROMs, they never show up in that space. And here's a closer look of the prototype build. Here's the later prototype build, with the X2 removed. Also, the exit icon in the prototype build looks a little different, and here's the final version. With all the subtanks, Zero's parts, every single weapon, everything. Alright, select stage. Early stage select. Not really seeing any differences just from first glance, but let's see what they say. The final game removes the data from the stage info toggle, as you can see over here in the first two prototype builds. The large gray building in the middle left is labeled in both prototypes. In the early version is EH, presumably romanizing the character, whatever that is, to an E instead of an I, and IH for irregular hunters, named Maverick Hunters in the international releases. In the later prototypes, the label was removed in final versions. Here's a closer look at him. I think this is the gray building they're talking about over here. Most likely the Maverick Hunter base. Or, excuse me, the irregular hunters in Japanese versions. And here's another closer look at an early version of the map. And after defeating 3 Mavericks in the later prototype, the Maverick Hunters building is destroyed. In the final game, if the player doesn't collect all of Zero's parts, there's a cutscene that explains that one of the X-Hunters stormed the base and stole all of Zero's parts back, including his control chip. But there's no visual indication of this. It's possible that the building should have been destroyed after destroying 2 Mavericks, not 3, since that's when the X-Hunters show up. Both prototypes are missing the cutscene that plays after defeating 2 Mavericks, and the one after all 8 Mavericks. In the early prototype, defeating all 8 Mavericks would not change the stage select screen at all. In the later prototype, the X Hunter base button would be added to the stage select, but it cannot be entered. Alright, here's an early version of this base. Here's a later prototype build. And here's the final version. Alright, the X-Hunter map palette doesn't get as dark as it should in the early prototypes. The X-Hunter's base has a different design in the early samples. There are a few coloring errors on the X-Hunter base in both prototypes. Check out the pink pipes in the bottom middle of the image, though the newer prototype fixes a few of the ones from the older build. Here's what that looks like, with their base destroyed. And here's the final version. The graphics for the destroyed X-Hunter's base aren't in the early prototypes. The destroyed X-Hunter base has the same coloring errors and introduces another one by coloring the 3 tower pieces yellow. Alright, here's an early version of that little graphic that's a little green now and flashes yellow and red. And now the later versions will be in more of a pink, orange, and green. Yeah, pink, yellow, orange, and green colors you can see here. The cursor's cycling palette is different in the early prototype, transitioning from a teal to cyan to orange. It was changed to a more natural magenta pink to orange cycle in the later prototypes. The map points changed from teal to pink too, but the light rotation changed as well. The early prototype has more frames than the later prototype, but the light never directly faces the screen. The final version added a straight-on frame, but had to delete one of the rotational frames to make the light rotate properly. Here's what that looks like. I kind of like this green one. That's way too small to see. And here's the final version, which is more pinkish. Or magenta, whichever one you want to say. The static sprite overlay is brighter in the early prototype version. I guess that would play after you defeated a Maverick. It's a little darker here, so that's a bit of a minor change. The static sprite overlay is brighter in the early... Oh wait, I already read that. Alright, though the X-Hunters never appear on the world map in the early prototype, those sprites are in the ROMs. Agile and Violin are particularly different. Yeah, they look a little crustier, I guess. Those sprites don't look the best. While Surgis's only went through minor shading and color changes. I always thought Surgis's sprite looked a little funny. Like, he looks like he has no arms. Alright, that's what it looks like there, and here's the final version. Alright, text. Early prototype. I'll let you all read that. If you'd like to pause the screen, go on ahead. Alright. While the early prototype doesn't display a text on the stage select, there is some preliminary stages info in the ROM, starting at 0x027770 and repeated at 0x0279CD. Every stage but the first uses a preliminary name. Only 2 bosses are named. Now both of those bosses use different romanizations at the final game. The X-Hunter/Counter Hunter base is labeled Sigma Stage 1, which suggests that there would be multiple labels. But the later prototypes and final game uses the same labels from each X-Hunter stage. In the later prototype, the centipede boss is called Magna 100-Legger, which is a dumb name, but okay. On the stage select and Magna Hrykulgur, I cannot pronounce that, on the Maverick intro screen. The larger font that the Maverick intro screen uses doesn't have a 1 or a 0 on it. Instead of adding those to the font, the developers just changed the stage select name. Both names mean the same thing anyway. And the boss intro. The early prototype doesn't display boss intros. Closer inspection of the code reveals that the Maverick's names and intro code are identical to the first X game, or Rockman X. And here's what it looks like. It's a little darker noticeably. And this one's just a bit lighter. At Sigma's sigil or symbol. And the beam of light, or whatever that is, what is that anyways, this little beam of light over here, are brighter in the later prototypes. The background is laid out differently. The early background also has a cycling palette that was removed in the final game. For whatever reason, maybe they thought it was too flashy. But anyways, now we can continue on to the 8 Mavericks Part 1. Generic differences. Strangely, the Maverick boss stages intros can be skipped by pressing Start in the prototype. A missing feature which doesn't get implemented until X3. In the early prototype, there is no elaborate destruction sequence for the Mavericks. They simply explode like normal enemies, followed by X teleporting out abruptly. Mavericks don't have boss music in this early build, most likely because those animations weren't done yet, and the Maverick boss theme wasn't made yet. The X-Hunters. The X-Hunters fight have just barely been started on the early prototype. Only Wire Sponge, Flame Stag, and Magna Centipede stage have working X-Hunter doors. The other ones just hadn't been fully functional yet. Agile is the only X-Hunter that can be encountered. Surges is coded but can't be fought anywhere without hacking, while Violin has his graphics in the ROM but hasn't been programmed yet. Agile is always present in each of the aforementioned stages. Defeating him does nothing. If the player loses a life or exits the stage, Agile will respawn. The X-Hunters have no entrance or exit dialogue. Even though the X-Hunters theme is in the game and is already used by the gigantic Mechanoid boss, it doesn't play during the X-Hunters fight, for whatever reason. It was most likely used for that boss fight to test it out or something, they just didn't put it in there yet. The You Got Zero, part number 1, 2, and 3, strings aren't in either prototype. They didn't make the code for that just yet. So, the text that tells you that, yeah, you got this zero body part. Alright, it looks like the weakness tables have been planted in for the X-Hunters, but they were changed in the final version. Alright, Agile is weak to Silk Shot in the prototype. Unless he's encountered in Crystal Snail or a Wire Sponge stage, he takes 1 damage, and I guess the other part might count for the charged version of said weapon, from the Crystal and Leaf shots. 4-6 damage from the Rock Shot, and 6-on-6 damage for the Junk Shot. In the final game, he only takes 1 damage, except from the Rock Shot, which does 3 to 5 damage. As you can see with the weakness tables over here. In the final version, he takes more damage from what was it called? Magnamine, I believe. Yeah, consistent weakness to Magnamine, as I just stated. Surges. Looks like he has a weakness to Sonic Slicer in the final game. Surges takes full damage from the X-Buster, but is weak to Bubble Slash in the prototype. While he's weak to Sonic Slicer and Crystal Silk Shot. What? That's not how you... whatever. In the final game, Speed Burner was added as a secondary weakness, as you can see right over here. Though the charged version, weirdly enough, does less damage. Alright, damage taken, the Mine does 1 HP. In the final game, it's given to 4 HP, while the Contact does 2 damage. In the final game, if you make contact with him, it does 3 damage. Alright, Violin, his weakness table. Violin is only weak to Spin Wheel in the later prototype, but he takes full damage from the X-Buster. The final game gives him weaknesses to Bubble Splash, Sonic Slicer, and the Leaf Silk Shot, as you can see in this damage table over here. And here's a used version of Violent Spike Ball. And if you give him contact, or you take contact, you take 4 damage in the prototype and 3 damage in the final version. His makes you do 6 damage in the prototype, 5 damage in the final version. Maybe because they thought it was too hard if he was hitting too hard, I don't know. In the earlier prototype, there's an extra Morningstar graphic with larger spikes and Violence tile set. The smaller spiked Morningstar is already in its tile set, so it's not clear where the larger spiked version would have been used. Most likely during the Sigma stages, probably. Or maybe this was an early version of that fight. This graphic was deleted in later prototypes. Here's a closer look at the used one. And here's a closer version of the unused one. Which actually, I kind of prefer that one. It looks better. It looks more deadly, too. Wire Sponges, Wire Hitimaru, which is his Japanese name, level graphic. The stage background is 64 pixels wider in the early prototype. Later version sacrificed the symmetry of the older background to save space. And here's what it looks like. Alright, layouts, and this looks like an early version of Wire Sponge's stage. In both prototypes, this stage is missing its heart tank. Because it's all the way over here, that's why. It wasn't put there yet. As you can see over here in the final game. And there isn't really a place to hide one either. Because they didn't have the space there yet, most likely. To fix this, the developers extended the starting wall further right and hid a heart tank inside of it. Early versions of the game use a different palette for the building section of our sponge stage. The palette is a dull yellow-green scheme in the early version prototype, while the later prototype uses a darker green and bright blue-gray color. The final game changes the green floor to use a lighter palette, while the column in the backs are darker. The blue-gray walls were redrawn in the final version. The pipes and tubes in the background are arranged differently in each version of the game. It is commonly changed throughout the stage, and here's a closer look. Alright, the leaves in Wire Sponge's trees have basic flat shading in the early prototype. The leaves were redrawn in the later prototype to give them more depth. The flora on the ground, or flowers on the ground, were similarly touched up and arranged, with a few stems that seem to float in the air being trimmed. And here's a closer look at it. Here's what it looks like compared to the final version. There are fewer background details in the large internal range section, and those that are present are arranged differently. The top of the room has no details at all. Here's the early prototype version. Here's the later version. In the final version, the second croak hopper was moved away from the subtank on the right. As you can see over here, just a minor difference. I don't think it would have mattered either way. You could have had it really close to the subtank. The background details in the lower part of the room were also rearranged. Check out the opening in the walls. In the prototype, they curve up and down, and the later versions are always at the same height. Here's an early version of that. And here's the final version. Or just a later prototype version. The final version places the third and the fifth probe 8201U platform lower to the ground. Here's a closer look. Alright, there is a bar weighing at the start of the elevator section and only appears in the prototype builds. The floors are lighter in the final version, and the brown stripes that separate the outside and inside areas. The one to the left of the bar weighing had bits of details added to it. Here's what it looks like. Here's the final game compared to it. The bar weighing at the end of the elevator section was removed, and the spikes-laden ceiling was added to the top. As you can see over here, just so you don't think there's a secret up here, I guess. Alright, there are even more background detail rearrangements. Note also the difference, less detailed spike graphics in the early prototype. As you can see, it does look a little crude. And here's the final version. The bricks to the left of the spiked pits are assembled differently in the later prototype and final game. As you can see here. Someone must not have liked the bare patch of grass to the right of the spike pit, because it was covered up in later versions. You can see that right over here, and then they put a little covering over there. There are more pipes, tubes in the background in the final version, as you can see over here. A closer look at that. Continuing on Wire Sponge's stage. Alright, standard pipe and tube changes. 2 more strivers were added on to this once empty area, and the remaining strivers was replaced by a more formidable Aklanda, as you can see over here. Alright, and here's the final game. Alright, the green vines at the bottom and the metallic vines that surround Wire Sponge's arena have different arts in both samples. The metallic vines look blocky in the earlier sample. The later prototype adds transparency to those tiles to make them look properly vine-shaped. The vines on the ground are designed to perfectly fit a 224 length screen, but since this game's camera is actually offset 1 line down, the player can see where the lines ends. The final version fixes this by extending the vines all the way down. And here's what that looks like. Also, his arena looks a bit smaller than it does in the final version. Alright, here's the later prototype build. And here's the final version. Alright, most Mavericks take more damage from the X-Buster in the prototype version, probably just to make testing it out a little easier. The final game reduces the damage to 1 to 1 to 4 for all Mavericks, for the different levels of charge. The final version adds a second weakness for the Wire Sponge and the Speedburner that makes the powered-up Sonic Slicer properly powerful. Alright, the seeds have 3 HP in the prototype, in the final version they have 2 HP. The vines have 3 HP, but in the final version have 2, making them a little easier to kill. Alright, in both prototype builds, when Wire Sponge powers up, 4 bolts of lightning will fall from the sky simultaneously. The final version reduces this to 3 bolts of lightning and makes them drop 1 at a time. The prototype version of this attack actually reminds me of one of Dynamo Man's attacks from Mega Man and Bass. Our Wire Sponge is silent in the earlier prototype. The later prototypes implemented sound for Wire Sponge's antenna popping up and his lightning bolts, but he still is missing his charging sound effect. In the early prototype, despite the fact that the Mavericks don't have their long explosion sequence once killed, Wire Sponge will still do his sliced in half animation because it was finished at the time. They didn't finish the explosion animation, that's why. When killed by an uncharged Sonic Slicer before unceremoniously going poof. And here's what that attack would look like. And I guess that whoever made that animation for Wire Sponge dying to Sonic Slicer must have thought it looked really cool and they kept it in. And made it even before the explosion graphics. Alright, in the prototype intro, Wire Sponge does his little electricity dance. In the final game, he whips his chain around a bit. And here's what it looks like here. Alright, while the early prototype and final game have properly implemented haze effects for sunny and foggy weather, the later prototype does not. Something must have been broken between builds. Maybe. And here's what that would look like. We wouldn't have X with his full second armor. Alright, and with that being said, I think it's time that we leave this off for a part 2 later on in the next week after I upload this video. So if y'all enjoyed this, you learned something new, and you want to see more, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And answer the question of the day. Of all the unused content we went over so far, which one would you want to see, would have liked to see in the final game, and why? I would have liked to see this unused attack from Wire Sponge. That would have been pretty cool. But instead, it's cool with the one that we got. In the next episode, we'll continue for Moth or Metamor Mothminos. Thank you all for watching, and have a berrific day. See you then.